But imagine Mitch McConnell in front of a camera with him mic'd up is putting on the feather boa and saying, we're right. All right, Michael. So we're going to talk about sports and politics.
Yes, and how they go together.
And they do go together. And oftentimes, politics turn into being fans of two different rival teams. We have a two-party system. We have a color scheme for each party. We have a mascot for each party. And we even have bobbleheads of people who are famous, politicians. And all of it does. We have hats, right? I mean, wearing a red hat means something, and we all know what that is. And so politics in our country operates like a pair of rivals in a sport, and this plays out every election cycle. And even when there's not an election, it seems to play out all the time. And as Americans, often people fall into this fandom perspective where they're sort of, yes, they're an American, but they're really a Republican, or they're really a Democrat, or a conservative, or a liberal, whatever the label is. And we often fall into that, and that's where a lot of polarization can happen. It can feel harmless, but this whole idea of toxic tribalism or a polarized nation follows from being a fan of the team, a rabid fan of a team, not the sport.
Exactly. And I think we can all kind of relate to that sense in which we have identities all stacked on top of each other. So in the closest core of who we are, we might think of ourselves as, say in our case, fathers. We have families around us, we have occupations, but then as you go branching out into a larger sort of group context, you think, okay, well, I'm a US citizen. But then what seems so core to our identity is a sense of our ideological perspective, what we think about right and wrong, what makes for a better world, what are we trying to run away from, and what are we trying to run to as a community, as a better world that's made more progress. And we feel that there's so much at stake, depending on who happens to be in position of power, what laws are being passed. And so because we take this so seriously, it seems like there's an asymmetry. It seems like there's an entirely different game that's going on with politics versus sports. But what we noticed is that there are remarkable similarities in that we behave in ways when it comes to sports fandom, when we're at our best, say, where when we are capable of being fans of the game itself, fans of the sport. Like I love watching the game, and I just want it to be a good game, so to speak, right? That it's easier to kind of slip into that role. And when we do so, it's easier to have broad friendships. It's easier to have more camaraderie and mirth and excitement and enthusiasm, shared enthusiasm over a shared love for the game within a group of people. But if we were similar, if we could adopt that same perspective in politics, chances are we'd also find it easier for us to make headway on the sorts of problems that plague our world if we were capable of recognizing that it's necessary that there will be different perspectives on an issue, not because one side is good, one side is bad, but because we're tuned to different things, right? And having that sort of basic level of respect, when we all have a mutual appreciation for the game itself, right, allows that's a starting point, at least, for us to be able to have conversations that are more respectful, right?
Right, so let's talk about polarized America for a few minutes. So we have basically a two-party system. It's been very hard for additional third parties to enter the fray, and it's set up in a very adversarial way. A very wartime mindset occurs every time there's an election, and the reason for that is, of course, because people need to get elected. So they are going to say what they need to say to get elected, and they're going to present their case almost like a lawyer, where they're going to give, my policies are better, all of their policies are terrible, and it becomes hyperbole in a way. That if you take it too seriously, you begin to develop this mindset that moves you in a very polarized direction, and indeed a tribal direction if you let it get out of hand. A similar thing happens with regional sports teams or historic sports teams that you've maybe liked since childhood, where you have all this, they're rooting for this color scheme and this this team that exists beyond just the people. Right now, it's like the team keeps repopulating itself, but you're kind of rooting for the uniform over and over again. And so often this happens in our political lives. Whatever party your family tended to vote for, you're overexposed to those opinions. In modern media, we have things like NBC Sports and ESPN, which give you a fairly unbiased perspective on how the game went. And then you have these sort of fan-based websites that follow the team, or the team's website itself. That's going to be the most biased version of the draft you ever have, because no team is ever going to put on their website, we're just not sure about this crop of players. But they'll certainly tell you that on ESPN. And likewise, in politics, you have very responsible sources of journalism that try to cover things from a policy first, getting the details perspective, acknowledging that there are parties. And then you have outright opinion and propaganda channels that are basically going to tell you that your team is correct and how wrong the other team is. So this applies down the line. And so I think one thing we have to acknowledge is at the election level, sort of the national political level for sure, to keep your job, you have to say your team's right and the other team is going to lose. You have to. It's just the game. But as citizens who are going to talk about issues we care about, whether it's a political issue or a policy issue or just some value that we have, we're not trying to win. We're not trying to defeat the other person. So falling into that sports mindset, you can't take the team first mentality. That can't be your only arrow in the quiver when it comes to these issues. And so that's the challenge that a polarized nation faces.
And it's as though we feel that we have to model our communication style after the leadership representing those teams. Right? Imagine if we talk to each other about our respective sports teams and sports fandom the same way that the coaches of those teams are meant to speak, or the players of those teams are speaking when they're having to hype up one of the upcoming competitions. We understand that this is a public display. We understand what's going on here. This is a part of the rivalry. It's part of the fanfare. It's a part of that culture. And we recognize that there's a gap. There's that public face and that private face of that individual. We know that they're playing a certain role. And there's a certain quote by by Jesse Ventura that you like to try out in these situations.
Well, Jesse Ventura was a pro wrestler, so the ultimate sort of good versus evil narrative playing out. And I don't think it's really a spoiler that pro wrestling is staged, and particularly in the 1980s when Jesse was part of this, he was a heel. He was the bad guy wrestler. And so he had to play this kind of unpalatable character who was sort of a muscle beach guy with bleached blonde hair who was kind of this nemesis, and he was very egotistical, wearing feather boas and so on. And when he did run in office as the governor of Minnesota, there was a really memorable interview with him where someone was saying, "Well, you've said all of these things in your wrestling," and they were derogatory things about other wrestlers. And Ventura just said in his signature sort of voice, "I did it because it was my job." And it just stopped the interviewer in his tracks. Of course, it was his job to play the role of the heel. Mm-hmm. And for politicians on the debate stage or just in their public life, it's their job to always make their opinion be the true opinion, their values be the shared values. And of course, the heel is the person from the other party. So don't fall into that mindset. We can say, well, yes, they're advocating for their position. We may even agree with it, but there's a theatrical element to politics because there must be in the two-party system.
It's almost like taking the game way too seriously is really what happens. It can happen way too easily in politics. There really is sort of a fictional element to this. The person we call, you just name any political figure out there, or whether it's Joe Biden or Donald Trump, Nancy Pelosi, you just name them. The person we have in our mind is so divorced from reality because we've never met that person, right? It's whoever is concocted by the media apparatus in order to play a certain role. And the role here is to induce certain actions, whether it's to vote for this candidate or that candidate, give campaign contributions in this direction, that direction. They're trying to spur action, from us, right? And so it's going to be hyperbolic. It's going to be laden with all sorts of judgment calls about that individual, but you're eradicating the person there, the fact that they have a family, the fact there's much more to them than just the political actor per se.
Yeah, I can't think of a person less like Jesse Ventura than Mitch McConnell. But imagine Mitch McConnell in front of a camera with a mic'd up is putting on the feather boa and saying, we're right, because it's his job once again. And I think it's helpful. It's a healthy attitude if you can start to realize that when politicians are talking in front of the camera, it's public face, right? They're playing the role. They are being part of the team, just like a coach for a sports team is always going to try to put his team and his strategy in the best light. They're never going to admit that the other side has a really good chance and actually has a better defense, right? It would be foolish to do so. And so I've come around, when we've talked about this, I've come around to this perspective of remembering that politicians have a private opinion as well. When they're not on camera, they probably do have a more nuanced viewpoint that isn't as straightforward, and they probably appreciate their opponent's viewpoint is not so obviously terrible as they're going to say in public. So we have a public and a private persona, and politicians do as well. We can keep that in mind.
It's not so unlike, just speaking from a world that I'm more familiar with just on a personal basis, say with mixed martial arts. If there's a coach who's talking about their fighter and trying to hype them up before a competition, they're not going to go to the press conference and say, well, my fighter here, he's got excellent offense when it comes to these attributes, but I'll tell you what, though, he has a really difficult time protecting his ribs. I'm imagining my opponent's just going to piece him up when he gets him in a clinch. And that's not what happens, right? As far as they're concerned, they have no weaknesses. They're ready for this challenge, no matter what comes, right? And that's typically what happens when you have that firebrand sort of bravado and political speech making. It's like, we have no weaknesses, right? We're ready for all comers. And that sort of confidence is what they understand attracts support. Confidence is a major indicator to our minds of leadership. Whether or not it's misplaced, right? That's an entirely different issue, whether we have misplaced our trust or not. But one of the reasons why politics looks the way it does and sounds the way it does is because consultants who try to understand the human mind, the behavior of voters, try to encourage or coach candidates to give off these cues, these signals that they think will attract more support. And it might seem deceptive at its core, but ultimately they're trying to figure out how to win. Similar to what happens in sports games. The reason why certain tactics are used, certain strategies are used, is because it's thought to increase their chances of winning the game. And if we think along those lines, it makes it a little bit easier for us to divorce the human being from the role that they're playing.
Yeah, and likewise, opinion news, sort of very slanted news. Pick your, you can fill in which networks we're talking about here or which websites we're talking about here. It's like going to the team's website where they're going to presenting it to the fan base, really. If you want to know how the Green Bay Packers are going to do next year, don't go to greenbaypackers.com. They're going to, of course, win the Super Bowl. But less biased opinions involve, taking the wider complexities of the sport into context. So this is one of the challenges that we have as citizens in a polarized country. Too many people fall into this trap that they think they're rooting for a team, and that's being patriotic is to, fly the blue flag or the red flag all the time and follow the politicians at their word in front of the mic and follow the opinion news outlets too carefully. So imagine you're a football fan and the Patriots are playing and someone shows up in their Patriots garb for to watch the game, and they act like Bill Belichick the entire night, just insisting that the Patriots are the best team in the world, and that imagine how unenjoyable that would be. That's exactly how it looks when someone gets into a political discussion and they act exactly like they're a candidate defending all the positions, and they're not even running for office. It's madness.
I'm reminded, where I went, my alma mater for my undergrad was Southern Methodist University, and our mascot was Mustang. And the big rival's TCU, and the Horned Frog is their mascot, right? And I remember thinking about this not too long ago, about this analogy we're making to someone who takes politics, the game of politics, way too seriously. It would be akin to somebody on campus when we had this, what was called Fried the Frogs Day, right? Where they had the frog legs. It's just a way of, kind of ribbing the rival team.
Something kind of comical.
Yes, some kind of comical, right? But there's like a sort of violent undertone to it. It'd be as though if somebody actually did show up, like meaning to have violence, like if they actually showed up ready for battle and said, okay, we're ready to fry the frogs, you would look at that person and say, okay, there's something wrong with you. You realize we're all just having fun here, right? This is a part of the game. And what's difficult, I think, when it comes to politics, because there is so much at stake, we are talking about people's lives, talking about whether or not families are going to be able to have programs that would help them out of poverty, right? Whether school lunches are free or not, whether there's access to birth control. Like, there's so much at stake. We are more likely to engage in sort of like moral grandstanding, right, about these things.
Yeah.
But understanding that beneath all of that is in someone who's very much like you in their private lives, where they're just as confused as anybody else. In fact, there's an organization I really admire called Bravery Angels, and what they seek to do is they bring rival political perspectives together, try to find ways to find common ground, and they'll even have events with politicians who will come and attend, right? And many of these politicians, they also are eager for a world which is more accommodating of friendly interaction, of collaboration, and they're basically kind of in that pessimistic stance, like many of us are, of thinking, well, the only way to do politics is with animosity. It's the only way to attract voters. And so I think if we're looking for like any sort of cultural realignment when it comes to politics, is to explore an avenue that does induce action. It does induce the sort of progress we all do care about, but to do so without destroying relationships, to do it without demonizing each other. And as far as we're concerned, with our perspectives here, it has to do with the goals that you've set for yourself. Are you fans of a team, or are you fans of the game? In this case, if you're a fan of the game of politics, what is it? In this case, it's a game of understanding fundamentally what is it that led you to have a certain outlook on the world, such that you think going this direction is a worse world and going that direction is a better world. That's fundamentally what you're learning about a person. And what opinions they came to, the judgments they came to, that's not necessarily going to tell you if they're a good person or if they're smart or not. It's telling you a lot about their experience as a person. It's telling you a lot about their values that have tuned their compass of orienting themselves in a really complex world. But if you see it fundamentally as being just that, it's easier to approach it with an open mind. And dare I say, maybe even a better chance of getting them to change their mind, because everyone wants to be treated like they're a human being.
That's right. Yeah, and if you're seeing this as a call to be moderates, that's not it at all, actually. Michael just mentioned values. The reason we become polarized, it's not just overly following the team or treating a political party as a team. At the core of it are values, and it's appropriate for people to want to see their values carried out. It's in a democracy, we need people to put forward their idea and advocate for it very vociferously, and we need opposition to push back really hard. It's like watching a really good, well-contested sporting event. You want to see SMU win. But if you're a fan of the sport, you want it to be like an overtime win or just getting over the goal line at the last moment. Those are the wins that people think about and talk about. It's the lore of the thing. Or even if your team lost, if it was really well contested, everyone won who watched the game. And so that's really something we can focus on as well. Part of the sports analogy is that both teams do need to play the game well. They need to put forth their best effort. That's the only way we'll win. And in a successful democracy, we need there to be tension. And yes, we're going to fall on one side or the other with many of the issues, but we still have to advocate for not a blowout. What winning looks like in a democracy is a really well-contested battle of ideas, and one wins some of the time and the other wins other times, and out of it we get stronger policies and we get a strong nation.
Yeah, in a future episode, we'll discuss our own theory, a framework for explaining what happens when a democracy, when any sort of political system does wind up being unbalanced in one direction or the other. It has to do, actually, there's an analogy we're going to draw from our respective domains of expertise in cognitive neuroscience, understanding how the brain works with different neurochemical systems that have to be perfectly calibrated with each other and how they interact, right? It's called opponent processing. And good political dialogue in the game of politics helps with this balancing act. And when it gets off kilter, when you have a sort of blowout win where one team doesn't have a shot, the ramifications can be very serious in terms of the way in which certain groups feel disenfranchised or they don't have access to political resources. That's something really worth exploring. But I do think that this conversation was productive in motivating our understanding of what it means to be a fan of politics as a game, as it were, right? As opposed to thinking of ourselves as fundamentally being fans of one team or the other.
Yeah, and one last bit about pro wrestling. So there are these guys called jobbers, and a jobber doesn't win. They sort of do the job of being the opponent for the Jesse Venturas to beat up on. And there's something there about the more flamboyant the politician, the more coverage they get, right? Jesse Ventura gets a lot of coverage, both as a politician and as a pro wrestler formerly. And so there's that aspect as well. There are those people that are doing the job. They are getting work done for our government, for our benefit, for our nation. We tend to completely miss those people. And they don't get coverage, and they're not, it distorts our mindset that the most flamboyant, the most controversial politicians tend to get a disproportionate amount of the coverage. So we make the error of thinking, well, everyone in that party is just like that person. That's not the case. Both parties have different styles, and media coverage isn't distributed equally. So we can think about that as well, that we are a more complex and diverse nation than one realizes. And so if you go to a sports party at someone's house, remember to tone it down, root for the well-contested game rather than the blowout for your team.
Yeah, those are some nice, encouraging words to sign off on. So looking forward to seeing where the conversation leads next.
Me too.
Thank you.